5. Today we're undertaking a critical review of a really fascinating discussion between Dr. Sunil Parab and Dr. Ashok Aklujkar. And it focuses intensely on ancient Indian literature, mythology, and I guess the challenging world of historical scholarship.
Exactly. Our mission here is to take a stack of this foundational research and really address one core question. Is it enough? Is relying solely on English translations of Sanskrit texts sufficient for any kind of serious academic work?
Right, and if we just cut straight to the chase, what's the blunt answer the source material gives us?
The answer is a pretty definitive no. Generally speaking, those translations are just not adequate for deep scholarship.
Hmm.
And the experts argue that we've paid a huge price for being, well, complacent with these existing versions for decades.
That's a huge claim. I mean, it implies that so much of what we think we know about ancient history might be built on, I don't know, shaky foundations. So what does that really mean for researchers and for you, the learner, trying to grasp all this? Today, we're going to dive deep into exactly why translations so often fail, how this failure has led to some questionable, almost certainly wrong historical dating. We'll talk specifically about the Rig Veda and Emperor Ashoka. Then we'll get into the surprisingly liberal tradition of creative storytelling in these texts. And finally, where the really critical hard work needs to be done today.
It's important to start with some context, though. We have to acknowledge that there's been, significant progress in the last 50 years or so. Many of the major mythological texts, the Puranas, are now being translated based on critical editions, like those huge volumes from Motilal Banarsidass. They are so much better than the really difficult, often biased Victorian English versions from a century ago.
Okay, so we've improved the quality of the translations, but that hasn't solved the underlying dependency problem in academia. Is that the idea?
Precisely. And this is where the analysis gets really sharp. The structural problem remains, particularly in a lot of Indian history departments. You have scholars advancing to MA and PhD levels without a real reading knowledge of the classical Indian languages they need for their own field.
But I have to ask, aren't there benefits to relying on the best modern English scholarship? Why is that reliance inherently so damaging?
Because if you can't read the source language, you can't question the translation itself. You're completely, totally handicapped. Many older translations, especially from the 19th and early 20th centuries, they have this British colonial bias. They frame concepts in ways that made sense to a Victorian audience, but they completely missed the native philosophical context.
And we shouldn't be treating Sanskrit as this, isolated linguistic island either. Limiting the focus just to Sanskrit seems like a huge mistake if you want the full picture.
That's the linguistic continuum that has to be understood. You have Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit, and Apaprasha. They aren't totally separate categories. They form a single interacting spectrum. Scholars up to, say, the 15th or 16th century didn't separate them so absolutely. If you just isolate Sanskrit, you miss how the mythology was actually understood over time and across different regions.
This brings up that really compelling idea from Claude Lévi-Strauss that's in the discussion. He said a translation can kill a beautiful poem because the beauty is in the language, but it can't kill a myth because the myth's basic structure stays intact.
Right, that structural resilience is key. However, to interpret the myth correctly, to really get its emotional or philosophical weight, you have to go back to the original source. You have to look at native renderings. We need to see how these stories were transmitted in other Indic languages, or even in traditions that spread all across Southeast Asia. We really shouldn't privilege the interpretation of some 19th century English translator over these, long-standing native interpretations. They hold the clues.
And mythology isn't just about the big stories, right? Not just the grand epics we always hear about. We miss entire genres.
Oh, absolutely. If we just stick to the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and the famous Puranas, we miss so much regional and social complexity. We have to look at the Stalapudas. These are local place myths, historical narratives tied to specific sacred sites, like Nasik. They're rarely worked on unless an anthropologist happens to focus on that one temple. And we also ignore Vrata literature, which is crucial for understanding social myths and conventions. We just miss the whole picture.
So relying on old translations impacts interpretation, that's clear. But the sources are pointing to a much bigger issue. It completely upends our historical timeline.
Yes. This is where the experts argue that early Indian chronology is just poorly formulated. It's unreliable because the resources used when the timeline was first being set up by Western scholars were frankly meager and inadequate.
Okay, so this is where we need to get specific. How does this apply objective evidence?
The implications are just massive for how we date entire civilizations. Take the Rig Veda, for example.
Which is commonly taught as dating from, what, 1200 BC to 1500 BC.
Correct. But the sources point out that the older parts of the Rig Veda, the parts that describe the Saraswati as this mighty, flowing, thundering river, well, they cannot be later than 1900 BC.
Hold on. How does a river prove that a text has to be older than 1900 BC?
Because we have converging lines of evidence, geological and paleogeographical evidence. We know the Saraswati River had substantially dried up around 1900 BC. So if the oldest parts of the Rig Veda describe it as this major active waterway, that description has to predate the drying event. It links the text directly to scientific evidence, and it challenges the established timeline by centuries.
That is a fundamental challenge right there. So if the Rig Veda timeline is wrong, what does this analysis say about the Mahabharata?
It's the same principle. You look at the astronomical evidence in the text descriptions of star positions, celestial events, and it generally points toward 3000 BC for the description of the epic. And again, we have to be careful. We have to distinguish between the actual battle, which has unbelievable elements, and the dating of the textual tradition, which is often placed much, much later, sometimes as late as the 4th century AD.
But the real bedrock of all ancient Indian dating is Emperor Ashoka, usually pegged firmly in the 3rd century BC. The source material is claiming that objective clues suggest he should be no later than 800 BC. That's a 500-year swing. That would require restructuring all of ancient history. What is this objective clue?
It's not just one clue. It's more about the convergence of evidence once you strip away all the later, idealized versions of his story. What's so fascinating is how the historical figure of Ashoka just transformed over time. You can see it in the source material's breakdown of the 3 distinct tradition streams.
Okay, can you walk us through those streams?
Certainly. First, you've got Kalhana's Rajatha again. This is the oldest, most historical and realistic version of Ashoka's life. It focuses on him as a powerful, complex ruler.
And then come the inscriptions. A bit different.
A bit different, yeah. They're slightly colored, tending more toward legend, maybe exaggeration for a political purpose, but still somewhat historical. But the third phase is Ashoka in Mahayana literature. Here, almost all historical traces are just gone. He becomes an ideal devotee.
So in that version, the historical account basically morphs into a theological lesson.
Exactly. The story gets simplified to serve a clear religious purpose. He starts out as this cruel, wicked king. But because he performs one single kind act toward a Buddha, he's instantly rewarded with a huge empire. It serves to show that salvation can be attained through even the smallest act of devotion. It's very similar to Hindu stories of salvation, just by uttering a holy name.
Wow. So if we only relied on that Mahayana version, we would miss the historical reality completely. This isn't just, as you said, academic fussiness.
It's not. Whether a civilization's timeline is older and how it relates to other ancient civilizations, it has global implications. Intellectual, cultural, even economic. Scholars have to be encouraged to go back to the actual passages, the objective evidence, like the data points presented by K.D. Satna, rather than just dismissing views because they challenge the established but maybe flawed timeline.
Moving from history to interpretation, we are seeing a huge trend today, right? In novels, on TV, where mythological villains are glorified or new stories are written from their perspective. And we see it as this modern radical wave.
And this is where the sources tell us to apply some critical thinking to our own moment. The source material argues this trend is, in fact, essential to the very essence of the creativity of a tradition. The reason it seems new or problematic to us is because, 1, we're absorbing history through mass media, and 2, we've made mythology too strictly a part of our religion. We favor hero worship over narrative complexity. The original Sanskrit tradition was way more liberal.
So you're saying this wave only feels new because of mass printing. A press run gets thousands of copies out instantly, but the actual tradition of reinterpreting characters is historically rooted. It's essential.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look at the ancient playwright Bhaza. His Mahabharata plays are full of these incredible innovations. His play Udhuhanga, The Breaking of the Thighs, it actually tries to show Duryodhana in a better light after his defeat. It shows his good points, his principles. The supposed villain is not entirely black.
That is profound nuance for an ancient text. And then in his play, Pratima, Kaikeyi's motive is completely re-engineered. She's shown as deliberately orchestrating Rama's banishment just so Ravana would be killed. It turns her into a strategic actor, not just a petty queen.
And this freedom just continued. Rabindranath Tagore was a master of this. He went into the hearts of minor characters and the Ramayana, like Lakshman's wife, Bhacha's wife, to explore their side of the story. He even changed history, claiming Guru Gobind Singh deliberately wanted his attendant to kill him. This is just the inherent freedom of a tradition to reimagine itself.
That openness allows for really conflicting but maybe equally valid nuances. Look at the two interpretations of Ekalavya's thumb cutting. The contemporary reading, quite rightly, focuses on social injustice. A Brahmin committing an atrocity against someone from a tribal or Dalit class.
But the source material gives us an equally valid, deeply traditional reading, one that shows profound loyalty. In that reading, after the war, Ekalavya hears of Drona's death and he is heartbroken. Why? Because he couldn't kill Arjuna, Duryodhana's killer, and thus failed to show his devotion to his teacher, Drona. Both readings are justified. Both contribute to the tradition.
It's fascinating that even the Buddhist tradition, which started out so rational, test things like you test gold, ultimately incorporated mythology.
Well, it had to adapt to grow, didn't it? Early Buddhism was probably aimed at mendicants and monks, but when you need to admit householders, the Gaupatis who were the economic backbone of the community, well, the compromise had to be made, and that's when Buddhist mythology really starts to expand.
So it's not a totally separate category from Brahmanism then.
No religion just pops up out of a vacuum. You see shared deities, like Tara and Padmawati, in both traditions. The distinction, say, between Mara and Cupid is often just one of name and emphasis. Mara is often shown with a military aspect and attacking force, while Cupid is more about romance. But the underlying concept, the god of desire, comes from a shared background.
So if the original sources are the key to unlocking all this, we have to talk about academic methodology. The experts contrasted the patterns in India versus abroad, especially around training.
Yeah, and that disparity is huge, and it starts early. In the West, students are trained for independence from a young age. They learn to navigate a library, to overcome the fear of research. They're told to find their own books, write summaries. In India, there's often way too much reliance on teachers just giving out ready-made translations and pre-digested answers.
That pattern has to change. So how do we foster that intellectual independence?
You have to involve the student more actively. Translation exercises, debates in philosophy class, and you never ever discourage a student by calling a view absolutely wrong. Instead, you challenge them. You think so, defend it. Lecturing should dwindle as the course level goes up. By the PhD level, it should be purely questioning their research.
And collaboration seems crucial too, like that seminar between the University of British Columbia and the University of Washington where scholars share bibliography and ideas.
That should be done way more widely. It's essential. But if we connect this academic crisis to the really big picture, the foundational issue is the manuscriptology crisis. This is the very foundation of the field, and yet the quality of preservation work in, say, Hamburg or Tokyo or Paris often overtakes the work in India.
And the consequences are just staggering according to the sources. This isn't about sloppy indexing. This is about things disappearing forever.
This is the shocking reality. An important manuscript is being lost every single day in India. The methodology to save them is failing. The National Mission for Manuscripts often focuses only on catalog manuscripts. It completely misses new finds in private collections, or what they call unintelligible fragments.
And the experts point out those fragments are often the oldest and most precious because they're fragmentary.
Exactly. And then you get these ridiculous bureaucratic rules that actively stop preservation. Limiting a visiting scholar to only 10 pages of a copy, that essentially dooms the rest of the manuscript. The next scholar might not come for 50 or 100 years. By then, the document is just dust.
So if we keep rewarding students for repeating figures like Max Miller instead of for editing new material, we're basically accelerating the loss of manuscripts.
Precisely. The outdated standard directly fuels the decay. We need to change PhD requirements to reward hands-on experience. Editing and translating a new, even short work, say 20 pages, is so much more valuable than a 300-page thesis that just repeats introductions. The confidence and training gained is what matters.
This has been a true deep dive into the cost of complacency. For you, the listener, the takeaways are crystal clear. Relying on translations introduces bias and misses the true linguistic tradition. Historical dating needs a radical revision, with the Rig Veda pushed back to pre-1900 BC and maybe Ashoka to 800 BC. And finally, creative interpretation of myths isn't some modern trend, but the historical, liberal essence of the tradition itself.
And if we connect all this to the bigger picture, the real race isn't about proving who is older or who is right. It's whether we can save the foundational source material itself before it turns to dust. The journey of saving and editing even a minor work that provides a link between great works. That's infinitely more valuable right now than just copying or debating famous scholars.
A profound thought on the fragility and the urgency of knowledge preservation. Thank you for joining us.